Good morning. A bit of bread from Mark 6:33 through 44. Now many saw Jesus and the disciples going forward. Let me start over again. Now, many saw Jesus and the disciples going toward a remote area and recognized them, and the word got around. From the surrounding towns, people went out on foot, hurrying, and got there ahead of them. When Jesus arrived, he saw this huge crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the hour is late. Send them away and go into the country and villages round about and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend a fortune buying bread and giving it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do we have? Go and see." They came back with an inventory of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to sit down in groups upon the grass. So they sat down by hundreds and fifties, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. There were over 5,000 fed that day.
It's hard to believe that was just a couple of days ago. It all started out when my husband came running out of the fields in the middle of the day. Before I could scold him for stopping work before the sun had set, he told me that the rabbi, the one they call Yeshua, was but a 2-day walk away. Some men who had seen him in Magdala had cut through the fields on their way home and told everyone there about him being around and that he was crossing over to Gennesaret. If we hurried, we could catch up with them and see firsthand Yeshua, this teacher everyone's talking about. My husband rounded up the kids and our blankets, and I packed our food, a few loaves of bread, some cheese, and our water skins. It was still afternoon when the 7 of us set out. A few of the families whose men had been in the fields joined us as we walked through the village. Excitement was in the air. It was like a festival. The kids were happy to at least be away from their chores for a few days. And since their cousins and their buddies were walking with us, they played like they were on an adventure. The grown-ups were just as excited. We'd all heard about the teacher raising that little girl from the dead. And my own sister, she was in the crowd when a woman healed herself just by touching the edge of his garments. Amazing. And preach, well, they say he can lay a word on a crowd better than anyone we've ever heard. Maybe even better than Elijah or even Moses. Well, we just had to hear him for ourselves and to see him with our own eyes. They say he talks about our God as if God were a loving and caring God. That maybe we've been wrong to think of God as the source of all pain and punishment and death and drought. Well, maybe That's true. I don't know. Well, I'll tell you, it was a hot and miserable time to set out on an adventure. Didn't seem like no time, though, that the sun had set and the cold had settled into my bones of the night in the desert. It didn't seem like any time before we had grown too weary and then had to stop for the night close to a stream. On the second day of our walk, the kids had had enough adventure and their daddies had to carry them on their backs. But they were real good and they knew not to complain. As the sun was just about to set in the hills behind us, we spotted them. Down the sloped road toward the water's edge, there stood the teacher and that group of people who traveled with him. They stood around him like they were trying to protect him from the growing throng of people that had come to hear him speak and to work miracles. There must have been 5,000 people in that river valley. Luckily, as we made it down to where they were, several people had wandered off to go set up camp for the night. So we got us a real good spot for in the morning when he would resume talking and performing miracles. I was glad we'd be able to hear him because my husband's uncle went a month or so ago and he couldn't even see him, much less hear him. And the things those people whispered, saying things that the teacher was saying, well, how could he know he had actually said that? How could anyone know for sure? So early yesterday morning, after we had washed up and had a bite to eat, the rabbi climbed out on a rock and called out to the crowd. Then he sat down on that rock right there by the Sea of Galilee, like any rabbi would sit in the teacher's chair in the temple. Well, everybody got real quiet and settled down. We were waiting to see what he had to say. There is no way I can begin to tell you the wisdom that flowed out of that man's mouth. And the miracles, well, let me tell you, that's not been an exaggeration. What we've heard about the teacher and all his miracles, it's all true and more. But believe it or not, this isn't the point of my story. I still don't know if what happened was a miracle or what, but let me tell you about it. It'd gotten pretty late in the afternoon. I was beginning to worry. We planned to leave out when the teacher had finished and go find the nearest village to buy some more bread. It was getting late. We had a small bit of bread left, but not enough to fill up the whole family, you see. The kids are used to being hungry some, but we had a long walk ahead of us. I don't like for them to start out hungry and all. Well, luckily we were close enough to his workers to hear them telling Yeshua, send everybody away for food. Well, when they said this is a lonely place, that's no exaggeration either. The countryside outside of Gennesaret is more desolate than the plains of Sharon. A lonely place for sure, and way too late at that point to go find food. And then the teacher told them to feed the crowd. Not like he was going to do it, but them. And when they balked, he asked them, well, find out how much bread there actually is. The disciples started passing out baskets, asking everyone to put their bread in so it could be shared. As I watched the baskets going through the crowd, there were some who didn't have any bread to throw in. And then there were some who had a lot, and they were putting all of it into the baskets. Well, I have to admit, I was really nervous. Even though the teacher had just told us, don't worry about food and bread. Don't worry about drink. I must admit, I thought about hiding our bread in my pockets. Better to have the family half fed than to have them going hungry. But the teacher had told us that God feeds the birds and tends the grasses in the fields. I looked up at my husband and he just nodded. He knew what I knew. It was the right thing to do. What little bread we had, not even enough for a family of 7, got thrown into the basket along with everyone else's. It was just a bit of bread. Yet even with all the bread gathered up, there were only 5 loaves to go around. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed 5,000 people. Well, the teacher, he didn't even flinch. He asked us to divide into groups. And once we'd all settled down again, he prayed over the fish and he prayed over the bread, and then he broke it and he gave it to his helpers to pass around. Well, I'm not lying to you when I say that one bread basket went around our group not once, not twice, but 3 times. We had enough bread and fish to fill us up. While we had so much to eat, it's the first time I've ever seen my boys turn down food. And that's not even the half of it. After everyone had had their fill, there was still more bread and fish than when we'd started out. Well, last night I could hardly sleep. Not because I was stuffed to the gills with bread and fish, if you'll pardon my pun, but because of what had taken place. We had so little to share. Some of us had nothing to give but hunger. But everybody gave what they had. Everybody chipped in. And what little we had was multiplied until it was more than we started out with. Now, I don't know what's the miracle. The fact that a whole crowd of people, this throng, this community of strangers, stranded in a lonely and unfamiliar place, decided to give what little they had to each other, even though they didn't know it? Or was it the fact that God had multiplied all of that until we were filled? Seems to me that this loving and caring God that Yeshua speaks about, that God met us in a lonely and unfamiliar place through our own willingness to give. And through the blessing of Yeshua, that God took what little we had to give and turned it into more than enough. It was just a bit of bread. But God indeed gave the increase.